Alright, good day everybody. I'm Alex A. Gammer. Thanks for watching my channel again. And today I'm going to be talking about the 2022 remake of Hellraiser. And to give you an idea of where I'm coming from with this one, I am not a Hellraiser completionist or lifelong fan by any stretch. Honestly, I've always found just the concept of Hellraiser and the imagery behind it, and for that matter, the imagery and concepts created by Clive Barker as a whole, more interesting than anything that's actually contained in the movies and books themselves. And as I've gotten older, I think I've just gotten more secure just admitting that he doesn't quite do it for me the way that he seems to for a lot of other people. And whether it's fair or not, one thing that's always kind of bothered me a bit is that Clive Barker seems to be one of those figures like John Carpenter, where if you're a horror fan, there's this sort of unwritten rule that you're not allowed to say anything bad about him. But there really is no point in doing any form of criticism if you're not willing to be honest, and my honest opinion is that while I respect Clive Barker's influence on the horror genre, I think he kind of sucks as a filmmaker, I'm not gonna lie. But I digress. Anyways, when I heard that David Bruckner had been brought on board to direct the new version of Hellraiser, I was actually very excited and quite curious. I had previously really enjoyed David Bruckner's work in anthologies like VHS and Southbound, and I really liked The Ritual a lot too. So when I found out that he was getting ready to direct a Hellraiser movie, I was slightly optimistic. Because to me, Bruckner seems like a filmmaker who would have the technical competence as well as the uncompromising spirit that you need to make a Hellraiser movie the right way. And when the trailer started to come out and they started to leak some of the images of the new Pinhead, I was getting excited. Then, joys of being a Canadian horror fan without a VPN, I had to wait a little bit longer than most people before this one came available for me to watch. So was the wait worth it? Let's see. First of all, I thought that Jamie Clayton was an awesome Pinhead. She's different enough from Doug Bradley that she's making the character her own 100%, but it still keeps the essence of what makes that character Pinhead. It's actually a lot like the difference between Tim Curry's Pennywise and Bill Skarsgård's Pennywise. Doug Bradley was iconic and very effective in a theatrical, operatic way, but the way Jamie Clayton plays the character, it feels very otherworldly and unnatural. She doesn't move and talk like a human. Her approach is more like an alien scientist, very coldly and calculatingly sticking a needle in something to see what happens. Actually, without giving away anything too specific, that does happen at one point in the movie, and the fact that this version of Pinhead is much more deliberately androgynous gives the character a layer of ambiguity that creates an imposing, authoritative presence. And the general design of Pinhead and the accompanying Cenobites is really fantastic. Having their wardrobes essentially be a sophisticated form of bodily mutilation rather than black-clad leather is a nice way to update it into the 21st century, and once again it just makes their general presence that much more menacing and morbid. It really nails that repulsive glamour, as I think they refer to it, that Clive Barker was always trying to affect in the original Hellbound novel. And just the general production design is very strong. I like the way that they've updated the puzzle box, making it more of an active, evolving device in the plot. The mechanisms that make up the character Roland's mansion are very convincing and impressive. And the way that you see the landscape and the surroundings in the film shift in a way that reflects the shifting nature of the puzzle box whenever we're transitioning into the Cenobites dimension is done in a way that feels expert, exact, and always seamless. And beyond Jamie Clayton, the other two key players in the film are well cast as well. Odessa Azayan is very good as Riley, and I apologize to you, Odessa, if I'm butchering your surname, but yeah, great job. And Goran Visnik is also suitably eccentric, enigmatic, and creepy as the billionaire who essentially puts the whole thing in motion. Once again, Goran, I apologize if I'm butchering your name, but again, good job on your part too. And without spoiling anything, I will say there are a couple of plot developments that expand nicely and play well off of the Hellraiser lore. And it's also nice to finally see a Hellraiser movie where the Cenobites are, to a certain degree anyways, actually the subject of the film, rather than just popping up every so often in a serial killer plot. And mentioning the plot feels like a good enough place as any to maybe transition into my negatives on this one, because unfortunately, this was a bit of a letdown on a writing level. Because although there are good ideas, as I just mentioned, and even some other potentially good ideas that come up in the screenplay, the script as a whole is kind of unfocused and a bit of a mess. Which is kind of a bummer because by and large, I enjoy David Goyer as a writer. I mean, he's not perfect by any stretch. I can think of one or two movies of his that I do not like, but he's typically pretty dependable. And even if I don't like his screenplays all the way through, he's usually a pretty focused writer. Even with films that he's written that I have disliked in the past, lack of focus has never really been an issue for him as far as I'm concerned. But he was working with a couple of other writers on this one, so who knows, maybe between them and David Bruckner being on board himself, who also has a very strong creative voice, there could have just been too many cooks in the kitchen. That can certainly happen. And just to help illustrate my point, the most prominent example of this that I can think of involves Riley's brother and her friends. They're all very sketchily drawn, and for all the time that we spend with them, too much time in fact, we never really get to know them any better. It's almost like they're just there to give Riley someone to argue with. And while one of those characters, Nora, is at the center of what is probably the most effective death scene in the movie, you could honestly remove every scene with her character in it, including that death scene, and the movie as a whole would function no differently. And while Riley's brother is a little bit more important, the whole subject of his character's homosexuality just feels like something that was tacked on for PC reasons. I mean, with the sexual elements that have always been at play in Hellraiser, there was potential to do something interesting there, but they never really get into that. We do get one scene of Riley's brother and his boyfriend in bed together, yes. But once again, once you get to the end of the film, if you reflect back on it, you could take the whole element of his sexuality and the two of them being a couple out of it altogether, and the ending of the movie would function no differently. Seriously, just a couple of edits, and this guy would just become another roommate instead of his boyfriend. And without getting too specific, I will just say that given the fate that eventually befalls Riley's brother, this so-called boyfriend doesn't seem to get too broken up about it. Which again makes me very suspicious that the whole element of the homosexual relationship between these two was almost an afterthought that was just kind of tacked on. When you factor in that this movie was produced and released by Hulu, who is owned by Disney, it makes me likewise suspicious that this might have been an element that was added to try and appeal to the young adult audience. There's enough young adult material out there for young adults. Let Hellraiser be staunchly adult. That's how it was created and that's how it should be. For that matter, whether it's homosexuality or heterosexuality or whatever kind of ooality floats your boat these days, the sheer lack of sexuality and violence for that matter in this movie was a bit of a letdown. Before anyone goes writing me off as some pig who's only interested in boobs and blood, just take a second to remember that the furthest extremities of sex and violence is really the whole point of the Hellraiser franchise. Taking things to the limit and beyond on both counts has always been at least ostensibly what this whole series has been about. And at least in the first Hellraiser movie, one of the things that made it more interesting and distinct from other horror franchises was the fact that the characters that were meeting the Cenobites were not always necessarily simply scared of them. They were, on some level, attracted and seduced, or at least curious as much as they were repulsed. You really got the sense that the humans, on some level, as much as they knew that this was all wrong, couldn't help but feel, at least privately, like there was something about it that was a little bit, ooh, right, too, you know? But with all the Cenobites, including Pinhead, in this new version, you never get any sense of seductive sexuality coming off of any of them. For all their elaborate designs, they're essentially reduced to sophisticated slasher villains. Which, I mean, isn't necessarily like a bad thing. I mean, shit, Hellraiser 3 essentially portrays them that way, and that movie's a lot of fun, in my opinion. But in this case, I sort of feel like if this was your introduction to this whole world, there wouldn't be really anything about these characters to set them apart from villains like Michael Myers or Jason, aside from how they look. And then as far as the violence goes, I'm not going to say that you see no gore and no violence in this movie, but as an example, and I don't consider this a spoiler, right off the bat, when you see a character get grabbed by the chains in the opening scene, as soon as those chains latch onto him, he's put into blurred focus and set in the background while the main character Roland is in the foreground in focus. And yeah, you could make the argument that leaving things to your imagination sometimes is effective, but again, given that this whole franchise's reason for existing is to take viewers places that other films wouldn't want to go, it feels like someone pulling their punches, and that's not something that I would expect from this series or from a director like David Bruckner. And elsewhere in the movie, there's violent sequences that are cut away from so abruptly that it almost feels like they were trying to trim it to get a PG-13 rating for theaters or something. That's a head scratcher and a goddamn half for me because this movie is rated R and was released on streaming. And again, that's a disappointment because I always thought up until I saw this movie that releasing it on a streaming platform was the way to go because as iconic as Pinhead is, When you come right down to it, the Hellraiser series is not really a mainstream friendly franchise, nor should it be. And if they were going to accept an R rating and let it go straight to streaming, they should have just swung for the fences and let it all hang out. And that in turn brings us to our next problem, because there is no point in letting your dick hang out if it's too dark to see the fucking thing. Dark, murky tone is one thing. Dark, murky lighting is something entirely different. And there's more than one sequence in this movie where it's honestly so dark that you can barely see what the hell is going on. Evidently, the lighting department had a lot of extended lunch breaks while they were making this movie. The movie is also, I would say, at least 30 minutes too long. Cut back on a lot of the nonsense with her brother and her brother's boyfriend and roommates, and even the character Trevor for that matter, as much as he turns out to have some significance to the plot, and you could have shaved off 30 minutes right there, I'm positive. And with all the unnecessary elements in that screenplay, the pacing of the movie ends up feeling like pure ass, even though David Bruckner is doing his damnedest to maintain a sense of pace. I'm honestly not sure where I sit with this one or even what to say in conclusion, because the bad stuff is not the worst stuff I've ever seen, but it's so relentless that it ends up undermining all the good stuff in the movie, which is honestly really quite excellent. But at the end of the day, I think I have to give this one a thumbs down, because while there were a lot of things about it that I really appreciated, I still don't think I could wholeheartedly recommend it to anyone. It still did at least convince me that an updated version of Hellraiser could work. I just hope that if there is a sequel, that Hulu and Disney are willing to let the filmmakers take the gloves off and make it as extreme as they want to and they need to. Otherwise, it's kind of like hiring Bill Burr to be a comedian at your Christmas party and then restricting him to only doing knock-knock jokes. Like, why even bother? Anyway, I think that concludes today's sermon for the Grumpy Russian, so we'll just leave it at that. Thanks as ever for watching, guys. If you have thoughts of your own on this one, feel free to leave them in the comments down below, and I will see you next time.